There we go. We're live now. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Asian whiskey tasting. I know there's a few people that are going to be watching at a later date, so welcome to those people if you are watching at a later date. If you're watching live, as always, you're welcome to leave any comments in the comment box, etc. I hope everybody's doing well. We've got Steph with us today, who, if you've done a few tastings recently, you'll recognise Steph. She's done some great ones with us, and this is, of course, going to be great as well. And yeah, we're looking, as always, looking forward to it. It's always nice to have a sit and chat with Steph. It's particularly nice today because, as many of you know, we're refurbing the Shower Vale shop. And it's been a little bit stressful getting it finished, but it'll be fine. Totally.
So you need a wee dram.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've got a good lineup ready. And I know Steph's really busy. She's got the whiskey show coming up. So thank you for joining us. Obviously, it's really great that you can.
I need a dram. We're fine.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, we should be good to go. I'll give it just another minute or so, see if anyone else joins. But yeah, as I say, it'll be up on the YouTube channel later on this evening for anyone watching at a later date. So yeah, we've got 6 drams tonight.
Yeah, a good little range actually tonight. I love doing this one, but it's always different because we always choose different ones from each country. But yeah, it's nice. It's going to be good. Right.
We've got 2 from each of the countries, haven't we? So
that is right. Yes. Give a bit of an overview. So what I'll try and do is introduce the country, where it is, its geography, why they make whiskey, and then we'll chat through the sort of tastings of the specific things. So hopefully it all should make sense as we do it. I pretend to be a bad geography teacher, basically. So there's lots of maps and kind of like, this is hot. And that kind of information, just in case anyone.
It's remarkable because I used to hate geography in school. It was one of the things I just didn't get along with. And if someone had told me in school, be like, you better pay attention because you need geography because you're going to work in the wine and spirits industry, and it is about geography, I would have been like, you're lying. But it really is.
So much since working in spirits. So I used to work for a company in Guyana in South America, so I've learned tons about that. And obviously, Taiwan. I think a lot of people get confused with Thailand. So yeah, there's a lot of geography is helpful, and I didn't do it at school. I did history instead.
I know I did history too.
Yeah, but I love a map now. If someone tries to tell me something about a brand without a map, I'm like, no, what are you doing?
Yeah,
I can't imagine anything about this without knowing what it is.
Well, I've got a bit of an OCD about like where things go on the shelf in the shop, and I like especially the old world countries, like the wines and things. I like them to be in the like areas. So like for Italy, it's like northern Italy together, Sicily, all that type of thing. But I have to, if I'm rearranging the shelf, I have to have a wine map out so I can go through it and be like, right, okay, these are this section, so it's going to go there.
I can imagine your bookshelves now also are quite strictly organised too.
I mean, it's one of those things where I think that's really annoying me, so I decided to strip it all out, and then I got halfway through it and I'm like, why have I done this? Why do I bother? Yeah.
All right. Let's get cracking, shall we?
Thing to the stream stuff.
Thanks, my darling. Map number 1. Here we go. Here is most of Asia. Missing some bits off the sides here. But what we will be talking about today are 3 different whiskey-producing countries in Asia. And some of you might know better than others. Obviously, I'm sure people are aware that Asia's been making whiskey for quite a long time now. Countries all over the world are kind of adding to the list of whiskey making countries all the time, which is brilliant. But I think now, to get sort of categories, usually when I started learning about whiskey, there was sort of, Scotch whiskey, American whiskey, Irish whiskey. Canadian whiskey was talked about quite a lot, even though I never saw very much of it. And that was it, really. And then suddenly, people started talking about Japanese whiskey. And then kind of it felt like the other Asian whiskey sort of came around the same time. So, into our awareness and into, what people are talking about. And so now, obviously, Japan has a huge whiskey industry of its own. But then quite a lot of these other countries are building their own as well. So it's really exciting. So we are going to be talking about Japan this evening. We are also going to be talking about Taiwan, which is just off the coast of China. There's a small island, sort of bottom right of China. It is also yellow, so if you're looking for it, it's just there. And then we're going to be talking about India as well. So those are the three countries we'll be talking about this evening. We will have 2 whiskies from each country. I'll tell you, like I say, a little bit about how they're producing there, what impact the climate and the geography has on it, and the flavors you should be getting, the reasons you get the flavors. Okay, so if you have any questions, do type them up. They do pop up on the right, don't they?
Yes, you will do, yeah.
Feel free to ask any questions if anyone's got any, and we'll get cracking. So we're going to start with Taiwan. So like I say, I just pointed, I'll go back to the map real quick. So if you are trying to find it, if you look sort of that bit of China that sort of sticks out like a big kind of curve at the bottom right, there is Taiwan right there. It's on the Tropic of Cancer. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. You're looking at a map of other regions of the world, and if you don't have it linked to Europe, maybe that you know it better, you're not entirely sure how high up everything is. So yes, the Taiwan literally is cut in half by the Tropic of Cancer. So that means the top half of the island is subtropical and the bottom half of the island is in the tropics, which means it's a very different climate from here. It's very, very warm, really, really humid, very lush, very green. And yeah, extremely different. So of course, all of these things are going to have a big impact in the flavor of the whiskey you're going to end up with. So a couple of little facts and some pictures of it. I'm not sure if anyone's been to Taiwan, or what people think of it. I grew up as a child of the 80s. So for me, I remember, I sort of think big, cities, massive skyscrapers like some of these pictures, or just the bottom of kind of a cheap plastic toy from my childhood, because all of them were made in Taiwan. I didn't know what that meant, so I think, Taiwan, known for having, quite a large population, and also being amazing at making stuff. Okay, so just a little facts. It's about a third the size of Scotland, but it's got 4 times the population. So hence why they need the big kind of built up cities and lots of skyscrapers and stuff. So very, very different kind of landscape to if we're looking back. I link everything back to Scotland, sorry, because I am part Scottish. So there we go. So what we are talking about now is Kavalan Distillery, and they are actually in the northeast of Taiwan, and it is not as built up. So that built up area of Taiwan is much more that left-hand side. The very top is where Taipei is, but there's a big mountain range that kind of runs through slightly right of middle, and that right-hand coast is much less built up. It does have some cities on it, but much more kind of green. So it's this area that the distillery is built is actually 75% covered with forest, and it's between the sort of central mountain range and what's called the snowy mountain range. So even though it's very hot there, there has been snow in history in the past, not every year. So a little bit different from the Scottish mountains. But super clean air as well, because obviously it's not part of a massive city. So that's the kind of main difference here. And obviously at the top, hopefully people see the temperature. So, 14 degrees C minimum at night in the winter, which they don't have much of a strong winter, but it just gets a touch cooler. And then 32 degrees C max, in the summer in the daytime, and it feels much hotter because it's super, super humid.
Yeah.
So 14 degrees C, their minimum temperature is sometimes like a hot summer's day in Scotland. So it's a very, very different climate.
It's been like the past couple of days have been about 14 degrees or so, haven't they? 14, 15 degrees.
Early autumn, kind of. Exactly. So obviously it's going to have a big impact in not only producing the whiskey, but also aging it as well. So we'll talk about that when we get to that section. So the name Kavalan, the name of the distillery, is the name of this territory in the northeast side of Taiwan. It's called Yilan country just now. Most people in Taiwan speak Mandarin. Because Chinese people came over during the Chinese Revolution. So obviously communism isn't a great plan for people who are already wealthy. and who have businesses. And so when communism took over in China, quite a lot of the wealthy people from China left and moved to Taiwan instead. So the other reason that Taiwan is kind of great at making stuff, there's lots of wealthy families there, people who are very, very good at business. So most people now speak Mandarin, but there is a kind of older, ancient Taiwanese language. And in that language, this area is Kavalan. So that's the name of the distillery. Okay. So there was a tribe living there, as well as it being the name of the area. So Kavalan Distillery is relatively new. It's the newest one we're going to talk about this evening. And I think it kind of makes sense, again, when you sort of link it back to history. So when the kind of, obviously, the people had come over from China, and then they kind of formed a splinter government of China. And then when communism sort of fell in China, or, things started going a bit more back to normal, Taiwan is now seen as part of China by China. It does have its own kind of prime minister and things, but they're not really supposed to trade on their own. They're not really supposed to do any sort of diplomatic things on their own, even though they do with some countries. But actually, as part of that history, there was a rule that only the government could make booze. Okay, and up until 2002, that was it. So if you wanted to drink alcoholic beverages in Taiwan that were made in Taiwan, they would all be made by the government. Okay, so government factories. Now, in 2002, Taiwan wanted to join the World Trade Organization, and as part of being part of that, you can't have monopolies. They really kind of frown upon it. So you had to get rid of some of the monopolies. They're allowed to keep a couple, but they had to get rid of some of the monopolies. So one of they thought, like, okay, well, we'll allow independent businesses to make alcohol. Obviously, they'll still have to get licenses, they'll still have to do it properly, but let's relax that monopoly a little bit. And so suddenly independent companies in Taiwan are like, hold on a second, we can make alcohol. This is exciting. Let's do it. And obviously some decided to start making sort of more local style alcohol. But the family that set up Kavalan, it's the Lee family, and they own one of Taiwan's biggest food and drink production companies in Taiwan called King Car. They decided to build a single malt distillery. Now, that sounds like a crazy idea initially, because you're like, okay, you want to what? You're going to build a distillery to make something that's never been made in this climate before, never been made in this country before. But it makes a bit more sense when you realize how much the people of Taiwan absolutely love single malt whiskey. Okay, so if you look at exports by value over to Asia, Taiwan is one of the biggest. Okay, so volume, they're not that big. China, India, lots of other countries import tons more volume of quite cheap whiskey. Whereas what Taiwan imports is less volume of super expensive whiskey. Okay, they absolutely love it. And actually now, some distilleries in Scotland will do special bottlings just for the Taiwanese market, because it has such a good reputation and what they want to buy. Okay, so they love they're tropical people, so they have a tropical palate, and so they love things that are a bit more fruity, a bit softer. They don't want alcohol to burn. Alcohol in hotter countries can feel a bit more aggressive as well, so they want it to be very, very smooth. So they love a kind of Speyside sherry cask kind of action. Peaty stuff, not so much, but anything elegant, anything like say fruity, aromatic, refreshing. Is really, really down their street. Okay, honeyed as well, all those kind of flavors. So suddenly then building a single malt distillery doesn't seem quite so bonkers, because they know there's a massive market for it, that people will be really, really excited and really proud to have their own Taiwanese single malt. So the King Car Company in 2002, this rule has been relaxed, and they immediately send lots and lots of people to go up and do lots of research in all the whiskey producing nations of the world. And they also hired the late Dr. Jim Swan as a consultant to help them work out what to do and what they needed and how to do it and all that kind of stuff. So they started construction in April in 2005, and they finished it in December in 2005. So 9 months later, which is unheard of in whiskey distilleries. Absolutely mad. Yeah, so quick. I mean, super well organized, good at making stuff. I already, said that. So they're really, really, so shipped lots of stuff over from Scotland, had that all prepared. But again, if you're building a distillery in an area that's never made whiskey before, it's quite risky, as I'm sure you can think. Building a distillery is quite expensive. You won't know if it's worked for quite a few years. Also, again, with this heat, you have to be super, super careful. Things like, wooden washbacks. You're like, no, that's not going to work here. So, let's go top end of every single bit of equipment. So they really, really spent the money on this, bought top quality everything, to make sure that if there was anything that was going to go wrong, that was avoided as much as possible. Okay, so they actually got their first drop of new make, official after all the testing, setting up all the equipment, on the 11th of March 2006. So it's been 15 years now, but that is still quite, new for a distillery. Okay, so this is the distillery, and this is the area. So as you can see, it is quite green, and there's those mountains up at the side. That's where you get a nice water source coming from. So yeah, pretty big. Pretty lovely, like I say, really lush, and wandering around, it's absolutely roasting. The sun's beaming down. It's beautiful, and when it rains, it really rains as well. It's fantastic. Yeah, it's awesome. They have typhoons a lot there. That's the thing. So we got caught in one when we were there. It was actually fine. I think it was an easier typhoon than they usually have. But I've been in hurricanes in the Caribbean. So, it felt a bit more.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about production. So obviously the whole plan at the beginning is for them to make whiskey, the type of whiskey that they like drinking. Now Taiwan does grow barley, but not loads of it. And obviously very different kind of quality and style. So they decided to start importing most of their malted barley from Europe. They don't have a malting floor, so it's already malted when it arrives. And they bring in a variety of different styles, depending which country they're coming from, depending what time of year it is, depending what's available. Okay, but obviously always top quality, and unpeated. So Kavalan initially started off making only unpeated spirit. Now they have a few years ago started playing with peaty barley. We haven't actually seen any of the whiskies yet released in Europe. They have released one in Taiwan as a distillery exclusive, so if you want to try that, and I did get to try a little cask sample of one a couple of years ago, and it was lovely. So I'm quite excited about that happening. Currently, it's not available yet. So for now, if you taste Kavalan in the UK, it's extremely likely to be unpeated. So they also, the other main thing they have to deal with the temperatures of fermentation. So they have to use two types of yeast, and a bit different from the stuff you'd use in Scotland, because that's used to being a bit cooler. So French yeast is used to being a bit warmer. Obviously, France is a little bit further south. But then South African yeast as well is really used to being much, much warmer, but also focuses on producing fruity flavors. Okay, so that's what they really want to make happen. So they source the yeast that would let them achieve that. And like I said earlier, the water's from the local mountain range. So here are some of their stills. So these are all 4 sites, obviously the classic people that everyone in Scotland and most of the world gets to make their stills. These are shipped over in pieces and then assembled at the distillery. So this is their original 2 pairs of stills. And as you can see, quite a classic shape, descending line arms, and nothing too crazy about them. The kind of fun thing about these is I said it's their original 2 pairs of stills. So Kavalan was awarded in 2015 the best single malt in the world at the World Whisky Awards for one of their single cask whiskies. And the owner got quite excited, still owned by the Lee family. So Mr. Lee was very, very pleased with this, and decided that he needed to make more whiskey because it was doing very well. And so he, that same year, ordered 2 more pairs of stills. So he's going to double his capacity. Then the following year, in 2016, Kavalan again won world's best single cask single malt. And Mr. Lee got even more excited. Basically, rather than just building a sort of mirror image of this room nearby to install the sort of second set of stills, he decided to build a whole new place. So they now have 10 pairs of stills. They are capable of producing 9 million litres of spirit per year, which puts them in the top 5 single malt distilleries in the world in terms of volume.
Wow.
So from coming from nowhere, from a country that never had single malt before, their first distillery. This is Taiwan's first single malt. It's still there is now another one. A couple started up, but this is still the only family-owned one. To becoming one of the world's top single malt distilleries is very, very rapid, very impressive. So they're not currently working to full production capacity. They don't need to work to do night shifts and all that kind of stuff. They're working about sort of 2/3 of that at the moment, but the capability's there if they want to ramp things up. So it's quite exciting. But all the other new stills are the same shape and size and things. So the only thing that's a little bit different about the stills, I'm not sure if anyone can see from this angle. So if you come down the line arm and you look at the vertical tube there is another tube that's horizontal next to it, and it's basically a secondary condenser. In simple terms, it kind of cools things down a little bit more. So obviously, usually in Scotland, your condenser would go outside, and everything would condense out there in probably quite rapidly in the winter because it's cold. Whereas in Taiwan, it's bloody hot outside and it's bloody hot inside. So there's no place that you can fit this condenser where it's going to be able to do its job fully. You'll condense potentially 80% of what you want to condense, but let's not waste it. Let's make sure we get all of it. So they've got a secondary one just to make sure everything's cooled down and properly condensed. Okay, so that's the only main difference that you see in the production. And then casks. And while we're talking about casks, let's pour the first whiskey. Sorry, I just realised that you were looking thirsty there.
Which one are we for
Cavern Distillery Select, please. So there we go. Lovely. So this is number 2. I actually have picked up number 1 by mistake. So you guys have Distillery Select number 2. And so I'm not going to show you my bottle because that's not the right one. I'm going to drink some anyway. So the thing that makes Kavalan a bit different, and it's all again to do with the climate, and then the maps therefore, is the aging happens super fast, and so it is 3 to 4 times faster than Scotland. And so if you're setting up a distillery in Scotland, you think, okay, well, we'll make a range. We'll have our entry level one that'll maybe be 5 or 8 years old, and then we'll do a slightly more older one, and that'll be 10 or 12 years old, and then we'll do a 15-year-old one that's finished in a different type of cask or something, and then we'll do a 20 or 21-year-old one that'll be our sort of top range. Okay, so most new distilleries would set up a range based on age statements, and that would be what you see in quite a lot of distilleries. That's how they make the differences between their products. Obviously now we see a lot more cask types and stuff than we used to. But they can't do this here because their whiskey is aging 3 to 4 times faster than in Scotland. So it's all ready. I mean, it's really ready quite quickly, but they don't really say anything younger than 4 at Kavalan, just because they kind of want to make sure they've got the legal limit is not that in the country, but they won't really say anything younger than 4. And so they, to then get the next oldest one, it would taste quite different, maybe 6 months later to a year later. So they'd have a 4, a 5, maybe a 5.5, maybe a 6, so they'd all be sort of looking quite the same and quite low numbers compared to what we're used to. So what these guys decided to do in order to make a range of whiskies is to buy all of the cask types that you've ever thought of, and there are more than you can think of, and age the spirit in all of those, and that will be how you get your differences in flavors. And then you can either combine those together, which is what we've got here, or you can bottle them as single cask varietals, and that's what we've got later on with our second one from Kavalan later. Okay, so this is kind of how they make the variety of flavors here, and they make the same spirit every time, but then you've got the different cask types doing different things in the warehouse. This is actually one of my favorite pictures, I think, of Kavalan. For some reason, I think it's maybe the guy's outfit, but the like Indiana Jones, the Ark of the Covenant. It just reminds me of when they're sort of storing the kind of thing in the warehouse. It makes me think of that for some reason. Anyway, so we are tasting Distillery Select number 2. So on the bottom right here for the text, and the bottle on the right with the blue label. So it's 40% ABV, and these are both Distillery Select number 1 and number 2 are new releases. They came out over the last 3-4 years. to kind of be much more approachable, to be much more introductory, to be super, super easy drinking. And again, you've got to remember that drinking these in a hot climate, they're going to have much more kind of oomph, much more kind of body, much more power. What I love about them, though, is when you bring them to a colder country, a colder climate, is they feel super closed initially. So you might not be getting too much off the nose. So just give it a good sort of swirl around. Don't give massive whiffs. But, usually if you taste wine, you're like massive sniffs. And then in whiskey, they're like, don't do massive sniffs. You'll burn your nose. Whereas this one is kind of in between. You can get it moving a little bit. You can get your nose quite close in there. So have a little bit of a play with it and see how it comes out. But this is, like I say, a minimum of 4 years old. There'll be casks up to 9 years old in here, and that's the whole Kavalan range of between 4 and 9 years old. And this is a combination of kind of ex-bourbon casks and kind of virgin oak as well, virgin American oak. So you've got a lot of kind of, from the virgin oak, you get quite a nutty, quite a sort of, fresh wood flavor. And then the ex-bourbon cask will give you a bit more kind of vanilla, your kind of pineapple, your fruitiness. Remember, the wash is fruity itself. The spirit that comes out is super fruity. So that's kind of what they're aiming for here.
Yeah.
So as one to start the night off with, I always think a Kavalan is a great one because, the spirit is super, super smooth. There's, like I say, lovely fruity flavors. It's really, really easy drinking. Once it starts warming up in your palate, then you start getting a lot more flavors. Like I say, it'll feel quite closed initially. But it's just so easy drinking. And I think, light and friendly and approachable, gets your palate waked up, getting everything ready. So it's
like you say, it's very smooth. It's almost like butterscotch kind of really smooth, but then a little bit of spice in there as well. Quite like a sweet spice, and you pick up on that nuttiness, and it's really
exactly. Yeah, those new oak casks will be giving that kind of nuttiness. They are, toasted and charred on the inside, so they'll be getting a little bit of that kind of caramelization as well. And then the ex-bourbons are giving you those kind of, obviously the classic ex-bourbon flavors, so vanilla, butterscotch toffee, all that kind of stuff. But also what you find, and we'll explore this a lot more in our next later Kavalan whiskey, is that the ex-bourbon casks give you tons of coconut and kind of grilled pineapple, which is something you don't get so much in temperate climates. So the good thing about this is, like wines and grapes grown in different climates, you'll get different flavors of the same cask type because of the heat and the humidity and what's being sort of absorbed. So, if you think, ex-bourbon casks, they're a bit boring, everyone uses them and they all taste the same, then think again when you talk about kind of tropically aged whiskies. It's gives you tons more, and it's really, really interesting to explore.
It's still got quite a freshness on it, though. It's got this like resinous, like quality to it. Not hugely.
Yeah.
Just kind of in background. I'm assuming that's probably from the virgin oak.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Do you think environment as well? Because obviously where the distillery was, it was very green, and it's in a subtropical area. Do you think that also has an effect on the actual flavors that kind of?
Definitely. And I think they're not too far from the sea as well. So there is so the thing that was special about this northeastern area, apart from just kind of it's the water source and the kind of greenness, the pure air. The other thing that's kind of special about it is during the winter. So if you look at kind of the east of Russia, winds will come out of the east of Russia, then hit the sea, and then they'll kind of cycle south and end up coming in the northeast coast of Taiwan. So you have a little bit more temperature variation in the winter at certain times of year because of these Siberian winds that kind of come around. It's like our Gulf Stream, obviously in Scotland we get the Gulf Stream coming over. This is a cold one coming around, and that also helps, I think, kind of stop too much of the kind of jammy fruit kind of flavors taking over. It keeps it zingy. So yeah, it's it's a special thing about that location in Taiwan, having these Siberian winds. So I'm sure they don't feel Siberian by the time they get there. But.
It just smells really delicious, this.
Yeah.
And once it's opened up, it just smells really like welcoming.
Yeah. And I think that's the great thing about Kavalan always. I think, if you've got a friend who's, a bit scared of drinking neat spirits, not too into their whiskies, it's a great one to start people off, because they're always so smooth, they're always so fruity, they're so kind of easy and friendly. And I think this one is a brilliant example of that. Because bringing these two out after the range, the range has kind of got this reputation, the single cask strength kind of thing. So these are, a big departure from that, but just so nice. And I think, sometimes you want a whiskey to warm you up and, maybe sort out any kind of cold or so. But sometimes you want a whiskey that, on a hot day, is kind of an ideal thing to drink. And I've always find these refreshing, because again, they're designed to be refreshing on a hot day. Rather than be warming, because they don't want them to warm them up over there. They're already hot.
Already.
Yeah, exactly. So yes, it's 40% ABV and lovely. So I'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of Kavalan and its aging for the next one, probably. But if we don't mind, we can move on to whiskey number 2. Now we are going to do country number 2. So carry on sipping number 1, which was called Distillery Select number 2, just confusingly. So carry on sipping number 1 while I talk about India for a wee sec. And then once we get ready, I'll tell you when we'll start drinking whiskey number 2. So of the 3 countries that we're talking about tonight, for me, I think India making whiskey is almost the most obvious. Because, Taiwan, you kind of need, an entrepreneur who really loves drinking whiskey and someone who's really willing to sort of risk everything and throw lots of money at this. And in Japan, obviously, we have kind of a similar thing, but a lot longer ago. But for me, India, obviously, we took over India, right? And part of the point of having colonies is to sell them your export stuff to them. Right, that's a way that the kind of colonial country makes lots and lots of money, is by like, hey, we'll take over this massive country with tons of people in it, and we'll make them really like all our stuff. But we won't let them make it themselves. So they have to buy it from us. So we'll make lots and lots of money. And this is obviously what happened here. So we took over India. I'm sure we made them like lots of things, but one thing that we did quite encourage was them to like whiskey, and it did have a great kind of impact on our exports. But we didn't. We definitely discouraged and/or made it illegal for them to make their own whiskey, and so. But like for me, for them liking it, liking it for a few generations already, and having a desire to make it, partly because it's been banned as well. I always want to do anything if it's banned. Then it kind of for me just seems the most natural. So this is and we just had Taiwan's first single malt. This is India's first single malt. So Amrit is made in Bangalore. As you can see the map, sort of south middle-ish here. Temperature a bit warmer than Taiwan. But you can see the average humidity is half, so very, very different here. And this is very, very high above sea level. This is higher than any of the distilleries in Scotland. So really, really at altitude here. And just Bangalore itself, just the city of Bangalore, has 1.5 times the population of Scotland, which is mind-blowing. So these guys aren't right in the city centre. They're kind of out in the countryside on the outskirts of Bangalore. But the kind of amazing thing is that India became independent in 1947. These guys built their distillery in 1948. Now that is how much they wanted. They've been waiting. Okay, everyone's been drinking this whiskey, desperate to make it. They weren't allowed. And this is how much they liked it. And the immediate thing that happens as soon as the British, leave, is we're going to build a distillery immediately. Okay. Now, because of where they're located, they didn't actually start making whiskey straight away. That's quite a hard thing to do. It's super hot here, so they don't grow tons of barley in that south bit of India. So they started off distilling the things that they grow. So they grow sugarcane and they grow fruits. So brandy and rum was made initially. Okay. So that was the first wee bit. And then the 1980s, they finally managed to sort of make enough money to start making whiskey. Now, I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but India is actually one of the biggest whiskey producers in the world. If you're looking at biggest selling whiskies in the world. Now, the vast majority of them can't be exported because they don't come under what any other country would class as whiskey. So we're just talking about bottles with the word whiskey on it. Okay, now, so whether it's really whiskey or not is a debate. But yes, if you sort of get a big list of all the biggest selling whiskies in the world, then Indian ones would be kind of number 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 5, kind of thing. Absolutely massive. But like I say, the vast majority of them wouldn't be made from 100% grain, might not be aged, they might be quite dark in color because they've had coloring added, but they might not be aged for that long, might not be aged in the right type of thing, might not be the right ABV. Okay, some of them might just be random rubbish spirit with some coloring and the word whiskey on the label. Some of them definitely are that, and some of them will be made a little bit more traditionally. Okay, so India makes and drinks tons and tons and tons of whiskey. But most of it would be kind of what we call blends, if we're being generous. Okay, so in the 1980s, the Amrit Distillery was making kind of that style of whiskey, but they were making the sort of slightly nicer end of that. They were like, hey, we think our whiskey is actually quite good. Why can't we export it? What would we need to do to export it? What rules would we need to follow? Let's find out. Like, okay, cool. Single malt is the thing that's the most respect in Scotland. Let's see if we can make that. So they had been using malted barley and things like that already, had been aging things and distilling properly. But like I say, just occasionally they needed to top up with something else. It was, they're quite chilled about it. So they started being less chilled about it. And they started, like I say, following all the rules in the late 1980s to make India's first single malt. And so they actually, they started in the 1990s. The idea was in the late 1980s. And so they actually then did that. They launched it in Glasgow. That was their launch event. It was like bringing it to the most fighty, fighty potential place.
Hey, that's brave. That's a brave
exactly.
Launch being like, hey, we've got whiskey from India, but we're going to launch it in Glasgow, in Scotland.
Exactly. It's just amazing. And their launch event was a blind tasting. They had 3 variants, and they paired them with 3 Scotch whiskies. Can anyone tell the difference? That was the evening. Which one's the Indian one? And no one could. And they were like, ta-da! That's success. Exactly, success. So let's talk a little bit about how they do it. So they do grow barley in India, unlike Taiwan, but it's not in the south of India, in the north. So top left, the big green one on the left of Delhi is Rajasthan, and the Punjab region is just a bit north of that. So these are the main kind of barley growing regions of India. They're known as the breadbasket of India, actually, and it's the foothills of the Himalayas. So even though India as a country you think of as roasting hot, that bit at the north, to the top left, is really high altitude and therefore much, much cooler. Perfect conditions for growing barley. But the thing that they grow is actually the ancient version of the grain. So what we've done in Europe over the last few thousand years is unnaturally select our barley to give us more yield. Okay, so we grow something called 2-row barley, and you can see that diagram on the left. So for each stalk of grains, you have 2 rows, 2 rows of grain coming off it. So each grain itself can grow quite fat. It's got lots of space. Okay, now the bit that you want from the grain, the bit that gives you starch and then sugar and then alcohol in our production process, is the middle bit. Okay, so if you've got a really chunky grain, you're getting a lot more of that. Okay, whereas what they grow in India is something called 6-row barley. And so from each row stalk of grain, you've got 6 rows of grains on it. And therefore each grain is kind of squished in and quite tiny and quite lean. Okay, and so if you end up with your harvest at the your field at the end, you might be like, I've got tons more grains, individual grains from my 6-row, but all of them are teeny tiny, and the ratio of husk to starch is much, much higher. Okay, so like I say, we used to grow 6-year barley. I'm not sure if anyone's tried Bruichladdich Bear barley, BERE. If anyone's tried some of these limited releases that Bruichladdich, Arran, and a few other people have done. It's grown in Orkney, actually. I've been to a mill and seen it happen. It's been very exciting. It's my holidays, barley holiday. So it is a thing that we used to grow, and that we are starting to grow again in Europe in kind of heritage kind of ideas and trying to get back to how things used to taste. But this is the standard what they grow in India. Okay, so it's a higher proportion of husk in your mash, though, gives you tons more flavor. Okay, it's loads of protein, loads of flavor. When we've been focusing on yields to grow the 2-row, we've been losing flavor over these, years and years and years of plant breeding. Okay, so what we should be getting is really powerful, interesting, intense barley flavor coming from this whiskey. So let's pour whiskey number 2, which is, oh god, and I've got the old label here. Yours is probably a bit more, yours is more sexy than mine. The warehouse, they always still send me the old stuff because we don't sell it anymore.
I think we might discuss this on a past tasting, but the packaging for Amra is just so retro. It's so
I love it. Yeah, and that's so new that you're calling retro right there. I've got the really retro one. I like that. I think, you don't want everything to look the same and everything to look super slick and super, boring.
It feels like there's been a lot of whiskey distilleries rebranding Scotland at the moment, and they all seem to have gone for the same font on the boxes.
We've all seen a company that's doing it.
They're all rebranded, and they're slightly different, but they all look quite similar as well.
Really, how funny. Yeah. One of my mates works in kind of branding and strategy, and she was talking about there being, because I talk about there being sort of fashions in booze, so like tequila's been sort of coming cooler for a little while, and gin went through the massive phase and it's kind of plateauing maybe, and rum's been getting cooler for ages, and cognac's been going down but is it at the bottom and coming back up again, so kind of the fashions, and apparently there's those in fonts too.
Yes, there was. So my boyfriend's a graphic designer, and he's quite funny with it. He said there's fashions in that, but he's very very critical of certain font choices.
Yes,
kerning
I sent her a document recently, and she was like, are you a serial killer? Why are you using this font? And I'm like, it just came up. I don't know. Like I didn't care.
I've tried to do stuff before, and he's come in and gone, "What have you? No, just do it," and then takes it. I'm like, okay, fair enough.
Okay, fine. So apologies for the fonts on the presentations today. Just whatever happened. I'm not into fonts.
No.
So this, when you smell it, now it's 46%, guys, so it's a bit stronger than the last one, which was just 40. So be prepared for that little jump. So your first smell, your first sip. It will feel a little bit stronger, but do lots of small repeated smells and a tiny little bird size sip for your first one, and that will just let your palate kind of adjust, and then you'll be able to taste some stuff a bit better. But straight away in the nose, can you smell barley? Can you smell cereal? Can you smell grain?
So it smells like porridge.
Yeah, exactly. So this is coming from the grain, and I think in whiskey quite often we forget the grain. We talk about casks so much. We sometimes talk about water. I love chatting about a still personally, and a map and where it's come from, But barley is what makes whiskey. Like single malt has to be made from barley, and that's what gives it. It's where the flavor is coming from. Okay. Yeah. So, and a lot of distilleries treat it like a sort of a commodity, and it's just there for yield. It's there to give you alcohol, but it's where all your flavor comes from. So, it's amazing as well, because people say, "Oh, the flavor comes from the cask," and you're like, "Sure," but rum, cognac, all these other spirits also use casks. Do they taste of whiskey? No, they don't, and that is because.
I was going to say, the taste, the cask is like, it's like you season it, isn't it? Like when you're cooking, you're seasoning your cooking. You might put some spices in there or something, but if you're making, say you're making like a dish where you're using a particular meat or a particular vegetable, you can put spices and things in and flavor that, but if you made
The
a meat,
yeah,
a vegetable
the main
dish,
thing, yeah,
same spices, they taste
exactly.
different. The main
Exactly.
ingredient.
That's a really good analogy, Han. I like it. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's still a roast chicken. Whether you've gone for thyme and rosemary,
Yeah,
or whether you've gone for sumac, or whether you've gone for
exactly.
whatever. Okay. So yeah, so really, really barley flavor. Obviously, this will also have your other kind of standard whiskey flavor, so it will taste of cask as well.
Yeah.
This, like the previous one, actually, we've got tropical aging happening here, but with much lower humidity, and a bit more of a temperature variation here. These guys, this will be aged about 4.5 years as well, and it ages about the same rate as a Catalan, but differently. Okay, so this will be mostly ex-bourbon casks as well. So comparing this one and the next one is going to be interesting as well. So don't finish it if you haven't already. While we've been nattering. I love this. So it's not just flavor. You're tasting more barley, but can you feel more? Okay, it's much more textured.
Yeah.
Creamy, it really sticks to the tongue. Again, like your porridge note from earlier, I think the texture really brings that through. So
Yeah.
my favorite tasting note for this one is, when you have a bowl of cereal and you finish the cereal, but you're left with the milk at the end.
Yeah.
So it's creamy, but it tastes of cereal. That's the tasting note, my favorite tasting note for this one.
I'm a bit of a weird person where I don't really like milk on. I just have dry cereal. I know that's really bizarre. Some cereals
have dry cereal.
Some of it's really nice. It's like crunchy, I'm a bit weird with that. Just I don't like milk on it at the bottom of the bowl. But I can imagine what you mean.
I like the transition. I like the first few mouthfuls being quite crunchy and then it getting gradually soggier. But I do like to. I don't want to leave a sort of healthy mess. You know what I mean? I want to finish it before it loses its structural integrity. Anyway, back to average. This is the distillery. So not quite as picturesque as the last one. This one, so it was built in 1948, and then they have done it up since. And there is actually now a big modern bit. They just kind of opened a new wing a couple of years ago. But this is the front. This is the entrance. So you can visit if you're in Bangalore. I think it's just a couple of days a week. So you definitely want to get in touch. Kavalan, you can just rock up. They're open all the time. It's kind of like almost like a theme park type of thing. They get, it's amazing. I'll tell you more about that later. But with Amaret, you'd have to book, and it's just a few days a week. They were closed, obviously for COVID and stuff. So I'm not sure of the situation right now. But yes, not as attractive kind of situation. But it is a farmland. So the guys who set it up, again, family owned. It's a Jagdale family. And they're farmers, so they have lots and lots of farmland, and the distillery is situated near a spring. Yeah, so again, where you're going to get, because they're in the middle of the land, and it's not mountainous there; it's super flat, kind of plateau. But there is a lovely, beautiful freshwater spring here, so that's where they sort of focus on the distillery. Mango trees and everything all around. Really, really lovely. Okay. And here's a picture of their stills. So these are not Forsyths. They did make their own, but they look very similar to quite a lot of Scottish ones. And I think the interesting thing is, like I said earlier, they weren't allowed to make whiskey technically when we were in charge. People did, and there'd have been even British kind of army officers also making whiskey. I'm pretty sure. There's a bunch of it's difficult to find any real facts because obviously no one could, they weren't applying for licenses or anything because they weren't allowed to do it. But people definitely did. So, these stills are a lovely, lovely shape. I really like them.
How do they sort of differ from the Kavalan stills? Because the Kavalan stills are very classic, aren't they? What does it do? Because obviously, if you've got smaller grains in there as well, and you've got more husk, etc., in your kind of in your still, so how does it sort of affect it?
Yeah, so I mean, it's more actually about here the fermentation. So the fermentation here is super long. So Kavalan's about 60 hours, and this is about a week here. So you're gonna get a really, really long fermentation again, helping that creamy flavor that we're getting come through, helping all the flavors from the husk get extracted. And then the stills here, you can sort of see the line arms are pretty much, vertical, although it's a bit difficult to tell with the angle. But this narrow kind of waist that the still's got, that's going to really increase the kind of what we call reflux, the things struggling to kind of get up to the top of the still. So again, making quite a light, elegant spirit. They're not aiming for as much fruitiness as Kavalan, and these guys will distill to a slightly higher ABV than Kavalan do. Kavalan distills quite a low ABV to keep all that fruitiness in. These guys distill a little bit higher here, and you can see their wash stills on the left are a different shape from their spirit stills as well. So, but that's the other way around actually. Anyway, so you're going to get quite an elegant spirit here too, but it is more focusing on those cereal notes. And the texture, mustn't lose the texture.
Nice. Shave a little bit of that one.
So save a little bit of this one, because we're now going to go back to Taiwan. She says, "Are we?" Oh yeah. Well, there's some tasting notes. So I should have sort of gone through these real quick. So this is ex-bourbon, a little bit of virgin oak potentially, as here. So similar to the last one, but mostly ex-bourbon. And it's 100% that Indian barley in this one, for 4.5 years. Again, similar sort of rate of aging as the Kavalan. So I think we get a lot more, this sort of taste note here, the licorice, honeycomb, those kind of things coming through. So now we're going to go back to Kavalan. And we're going to taste a single cask type variety. Okay, so this is kind of what Kavalan are really famous for. The most famous ones are the cask strength ones, and we were going to do a cask strength one tonight, and I'm sorry that we've been out of stock.
Was it the PX one?
We were going to do the bourbon, bourbon or sherry were the two that we were going to do. And sherry, there seems to be a bit of a, we've not even got any coming from the distillery at the moment. So I think they're a bit short on the sherry casks currently. And we were going to do a bourbon one, but it's in customs right now. It's being cleared. Everything's delayed. So
that waiting.
shipping is a nightmare right now. So so you've got the bourbon oak. So it's the little brother of the what's called the soulless range. So this is 46% as well. So same as the last one ABV wise. Basically same cask wise for ex-bourbon. Now the difference here obviously will be the barley. So Kavalan is using European 2-row barley, whereas the Amrit was using 6-row. And the other difference here is that Kavalan, when they say a cask type on the bottle, which they didn't for the first one, I told you what those were, but this one actually says it on the bottle. It means it's all first fill casks.
Okay.
So just in case people aren't sure, when a cask has been used for something else, so it could be a port cask, a sherry cask, or a bourbon cask, when it first arrives at your distillery, so say the Kavalan distillery, the first time they fill it of their spirit is called the first fill. Okay, and that is when it's got its most flavors from the other thing that was previously in there. Then that liquid will take away some of those flavors, quite a lot of those flavors, and then age for a while, and then they'll empty it out, and then they'll potentially refill it again. And that second fill is called second fill, unsurprisingly. And that will give you slightly less flavors of the thing, the other place that it came from. So it was a port cask, less porty flavors. You'll get a little bit, but not as much. And then you potentially, if you're lucky, if it's a good quality cask and you look after it, you might get a third or even a fourth fill out of it. Okay, but by the time you get a third and fourth fill, like the fact that it was previously a port cask, it might as well be anything. Okay, because all those flavors have gone. It might be made from a different wood, or it might be giving something from that, but less from the actual port itself. So when Kavalan say a cask type on their bottle, that means it's first fill, which is a really unusual, because most people, the first fill cask are expensive and they want to use them for their kind of
premium
thing, special things. So most people will do a combination. So they'll call something a port cask whiskey, and they'll do a combination of first, second, and third fill in there, mix it all together. It's all technically a port cask, and they kind of get away with it. But most of it, you're not getting much flavour from most of them. So when Kavalan say, what's
a refill cask? Is that second fill?
That's second or third or fourth, just anything not first. So Kavalan call that, so they'll call them first fill, and then anything else is refill.
Okay.
And that's because there's such a stark difference between first fill and any of the later things. So that's your main difference here. The Amrit will have been aged in a variety of different fill numbers. For the ex-bourbon, the virgin oak obviously can only be virgin once. So that will all be first fill. So let's give this a listen. So same ABV as the last one, so still 46%. But I think it's a really, really interesting thing to compare. So obviously both of these, excuse me, both of these we have tropical aging. Both of these we have, you know, they're both about 4 to 4.5 years old. So really, really interesting to compare the differences here. Okay, and hopefully you're getting quite a lot of differences. Now this feels tons drier, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so tons more woody. That's the first fill action coming through. So, and if you think of bourbon, can you taste bourbon?
I was going to say, for me, it had like a slight, almost like chocolatey kind of note in it. Like this kind of, but like an earthy sort of dark chocolate. I definitely think it's got a more earthy kind of
Totally.
flavor.
And nutty again.
Yeah.
Because we talked about nuttiness earlier. Now, there's still quite a lot of fruitiness, but I always think of charred pineapple. So I'm not sure if anyone's ever had a barbecue and then chucked like slices of pineapple on at the end for pudding. Lazy person's barbecue pudding. And I think you get quite a lot of that here. But for me, initially, the main thing is the dryness, the oak, almost like heading towards tannins. But if you think of the flavour of a bourbon, because bourbons are aged in brand new charred casks, and can you get a bit of the char as well?
A bit of that sort of smoke on it, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So lots and lots of different things happening here. And again, you know, these should be super similar. It should be, you know, single malt, hot country, same type of gas, same amount of time. Not at all. Okay, so you got the barley differences, but you've also got the first fill versus not so.
In comparison to the Amrit as well, if you go back to that, the Amrit's got this real sort of like you really get the creaminess from the Amrit, I think, on the going back to it.
Yeah,
kind of
totally.
Quite a like spicy kind of barley note as well on it. It's
So really, really interesting ones to compare. And I think a lot of people would be like, you know, these should be the same.
Yeah.
And they're not at all. So that's why I kind of love putting them next to each other. And, you know, there's, again, different things for different times. So I think if you're quite into your American whiskies, then this one is really, really approachable. Still super smooth, isn't it? And the fruitiness here is kind of, for me, all kind of yellow fruits. You've got kind of apricots, you've got pineapple, you've got those kind of things.
Like stone fruits and things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Quite juicy fruit, like stone fruit.
Yeah. But it's weird having the juiciness of the fruit and the dryness of the whiskey. It's a really interesting sensation.
So it does finish very dry on the back of your palate.
Yeah. So let me tell you a little bit about how Kavalan do their aging, since we've got a slide showing it. And so this is their warehouse, the building on the right. And it's 5 stories. And what they realized quite quickly, because again, no one had made whiskey in their particular climate when they started, was that it was all happening super fast. And also the casks on the top, you know, next to the roof, the sun is beating down on the roof. That floor is much, much hotter. And it's all concrete floors, this warehouse, no dunnage here. And then the next floor down is the next hottest, the next floor down is the next hottest, and the bottom floor is the coolest. And they were like, well, hold on, we've got small casks coming from America, relatively small. And then we've got larger casks coming from sherry, port, and wine producers. And they noticed that the smaller casks age faster and the bigger casks age slower. As we know, your wood to liquid ratio in a smaller cask is much higher. Okay. So they were like, well, we don't want everything to age at completely different rates. And we'll end up with, you know, a 1-year-old whiskey, which we can't release legally or export legally. We'll end up with some, you know, 10-year-old whiskies, which is fine, but it'll take 10 years to get anything from them. So what they decided to do, I think, is super clever. So they're smaller, newer casks, the ones that would naturally age quite fast. go on the bottom, the cooler floors.
Yeah.
Okay, and then they're larger, but first fill casks go kind of upper middle, and then the larger second fill refill casks go at the top because they're the ones that age the slowest. Or that transfer flavor the slowest, so that they try and make all these different cask types, shapes, sizes age at a similar rate to each other. So they're all ready after 4+ years. And you know, you're getting lots of delicious flavors happening. So that's kind of how they deal with it. But they do, you know, people are like, well, you know, the speed of aging, that's amazing. I could build a whiskey distillery in a hot country and I'd be an entrepreneur and I'd be able to sell whiskey in it in just a few years and I'd be amazing. And you're like, yeah, kinda. So again, it's not quite as easy as that. So I'm not sure if anyone's read the bottom sentence kind of on the slide, but the angel share is a thing you've got to really watch out for. And in Taiwan, the original angel share, when they started the distilling, they started aging their whiskies, was 12 to 16% a year. Now, this was like, hold on a second, that is way more than anyone predicted. Because you're thinking, okay, it's 1.5 to 2% in Scotland. It's aging 4 times faster. So 2% times 4 times, it should be 8% a year, right? Like, why are the angels taking more? This is unacceptable. And so, yeah, at Kavalan, they were like, okay, well, how can we change that? We're not trying to make fake Scotch in Taiwan. We're trying to make Taiwanese whiskey. So let's not get air conditioning and cool things down. Let's not try and replicate the conditions of a Scottish warehouse. But is there a way that we can focus on catching this Siberian breeze in the winter, for example, to cool things down? Let's have, you know, windows that we can open. Let's see what we can do to try and like reduce a little bit. So what they actually do is they spray water on the floors at the hottest part of the day. That increases humidity in the warehouse, which therefore decreases the evaporation a little bit. And they also they have misters. So another sister company of Kavalan is they have orchid growers. So they breed orchids and they have massive greenhouses and they grow orchids, and they have misters that sort of sit up on the roofs of those rooms. Increase the humidity as well. So they do that in the warehouse too. But the main thing is trying to catch that Siberian breeze coming in and off the sea. Cool things down a little bit. So they're currently sitting on 10 to 12% a year, which they still think is
a lot.
It's still a lot. They'd like to get to 8.
Yeah.
Mathematically, like that's fair. So, but you know, they don't want to do too much to it. So, and it's really interesting. I sort of joke. I talk about Kavalan, like, you know, I go to distilleries. I love, you know, I take pictures of myself at the distillery, and it was the worst pictures I've ever taken of myself ever, because you're already roasting hot. Okay, then you walk into this distillery, and they're showing you obviously their mashing and the fermentation room, and you're like, okay, this is a bit hotter. And they give you a white coat, a lab coat to put on top of your clothes, and a hat. Okay, like a hard hat. So you're like, okay, well, I've just become hotter, thank you. And then you start wandering around these different rooms, and then you walk into the still room, and you're like, cool, you're boiling stuff up in metal. It's just really hot everywhere. So, you know, you take pictures of yourself and you're just like, no, I can never show anyone that. I've never been more red in my life. But then you go into the warehouse, you're thinking, well, this is cooler compared to the still house. So you're like, this is great. But then you suddenly go, oh no, I think my insides are sweating here. I don't know what's going on. Like this really, like into the bones, really too hot. And you look at the casks, and again, pictures of yourself, like I adopt a cask, and you write your name on the stomach, try and get pictures of it, and you're tasting loads of stuff. So then you start tasting gas strength whiskey, and then you're like, well, now I'm just roasting.
Stripping off instead, like, God damn it.
No, sorry. Yeah, people are like, oh, you know, because I come back from a distillery visit, my boss would be like, you got some good pictures, you be able to, you know, add this into your presentation. I'm like, no, you're definitely not showing anyone. I will not show anyone.
Maybe some if it's just like of the warehouse or something, but none with me.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, no. Shiniest of faces. So that's what it's like. But do go and visit if anyone gets the chance. It is obviously traveling at the moment is difficult, and we're kind of we're doing this in a gratuitous fashion. We're pretending to travel. Visiting the Cavalan distillery is amazing. They actually get more than 1.3 million, or they did before the world went mad, more than 1.3 million visitors per year, which was in a few years ago, that was more than all the distilleries in Scotland added together.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So these guys win Visitor Centre of the Year, Visitor Experience of the Year in the Whisky Awards all the time. It's just amazing. This is the entrance to their visitor centre. I was joking, this classic Taiwanese architecture.
That's so like, yeah, that's really impressive in comparison to like some of the other distilleries that like I've been to. I've only been to like a few kind of smaller ones, but that's just some visitor centre. That is like a museum in itself, isn't it?
Oh, there's a cafe. It's a place you can chuck the kids. There's a blending room, blending experience. The other kind of cool thing that I think is nice is that Taiwan is tons stricter than we are about health and safety. So, you know, we'll let people wander around a factory, and I'll always go and lick a still and, you know, kind of drink some of that stuff. You know, so we're in danger, and we're allowed to just poke our heads into things where our glasses can fall off into the fermentation tanks, and, you know, all the kind of stuff that they let us do. So you're not allowed to do that in Taiwan. They are like, no, people are going to drink this. Please don't let people drink it. So what they had to do is they had to build their visitor centre. They built the distillery along a long corridor, and then they built their visitor centre along a long corridor adjacent to that with big windows in between so everyone can see. So when you go to the visitor centre, that's kind of the tour that you get, is sort of explaining every bit. But a few years ago, they were like, don't tell anyone. But we thought it was a bit, you know, people couldn't smell what was happening. So we drilled holes in the glass up at the top so that the smells of each section will come through. So they're like, health and safety haven't mentioned that this is bad. We think it's fine. It's gonna be
they won't notice. Just don't tell anyone and they won't notice.
Exactly. But you get a really good tasting at the end. And like I said, the new blending experience looks fantastic as well. I've not done it personally. They did it after we went, but try all the different cask types. Try and make your own kind of Cavalan. It's a combination of cask types. It sounds awesome.
Nice. Sounds good.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah.
Right. So after Taiwan, hopefully everyone's enjoying the first 3 whiskies, and all, like I say, you know, focusing on the type of kind of spirit you expect from their countries, and all kind of doing a, you know, they make a single spirit, and then the differences come during the aging process, basically. So what we are going to move to now is Japan, which is a bit more complicated and has a bit more history that you can talk about. You know, India potentially might have been distilling earlier than Japan, but we have no documents. We have no proof. Right. Oh yeah, that's what we just tasted. It was non-chill filtered. I think I told you everything else. Yes. Yeah. Right. So I always show this map because I think a lot of people, I get asked the question quite often, how many distilleries are there in Japan? And I'm like, the answer to that is very difficult, because Japan's been distilling for so long. There's actually distilleries that have closed down. So are you talking about distilleries that are open and we're currently drinking the thing of right now? Or are you talking about just how many whiskies are there from Japan? Or lots of distilleries in Japan that have been built recently that are producing that we haven't had any product from yet because it's too young. There are also loads of Japanese spirit distilleries that also on the side produce little bit. So there is no right answer. So there are some. I already know like 5 that are missing off that map. That map's a little bit out of date, but I just quite like this map. Okay, so we're going to talk about Japanese whiskey and Nika, the Nika company. So there's 2 distilleries, but luckily for us, the history of Nika is basically the history of Japanese whiskey. So you're going to get all of it kind of at once. So this guy, Masataka Taketsuru, is the guy who set up the Nika company, but he's also known as the father of Japanese whiskey. He was born into a family of sake makers who were making sake since the 1700s. So as a young guy, he knew how to make booze, how to taste it, how to get different flavors from different production methods. But unfortunately for his dad, he wasn't that interested in sake. He didn't want to go into the family business. He was very, very interested in whiskey and foreign products. But And this is because, and I think a lot of people don't realize, but Japan kept itself very closed off from trade up until the 1850s. They'd seen what had happened in the rest of Asia, just talked about India, for example, was the Europeans turn up, do some trade, pretend to be nice, and then accidentally take over your country. And the Japanese are like, hold on a second. We see exactly how you kind of dazzle us with gems, baubles, and trade and things. And then next thing you know, we're homeless. So the Japanese decided to close off their borders, nice and easy as an island, and allowed a really, really limited amount of trade in from Europe, but hardly any at all. And so what everyone was drinking in Japan, therefore, was only Japanese-made booze. So I'm not sure if everyone's tried sake, but that's the kind of most commonly drunk thing if you want to drink some alcohol in Japan in the old days. But if you want to get a little bit more boozy, you want to drink something, a distilled spirit, you drink something called shochu. And shochu is made in a variety of different regions in Japan in a variety of different ways, from a variety of different things. But that was a kind of higher alcohol option. So in the 1850s, when trade started happening, the Japanese, understandably, were super excited about all these foreign things that they could now eat or drink or wear or what. Okay, so foreign booze was super, super cool. And if you were wealthy enough or connected enough, you could try and get some. Now, obviously, in those days, demand was up here, supply was down here. So it was just coming in teeny tiny quantities by boat. It was ridiculously expensive. So Japanese companies very quickly were like, well, hold on, let's try and bridge this gap a little bit. Let's make some whiskey. And kind of like the Indian whiskies I was talking about earlier, they made whiskey. They made their own spirit, they turned it brown, they put the word whiskey on the label, they did whatever. Okay, so that was the early Japanese whiskies until Taketsuru comes along. And he, as a young man, super interested in the differences between the faux whiskey that's being made in Japan and the real stuff that's being imported. And so he travels to Scotland in 1918 to learn how whiskey was made. And actually, I just got a copy. So he took tons and tons of notes while he was there. And they had those notebooks in the distillery, and they sort of printed up like limited copies of them, but with his writing, Japanese writing, so therefore not helpful to me. A lovely lady who's just translated them. I've just sent a copy of the book of his notes. So available. I've got it up here. Oh, stretch up. Sorry. This. So I'm not sure you can see, but this is called On the Production Methods of Pot Still Whiskey. And he wrote it in May 1920. So obviously the plan was he was to learn about how to make whiskey. There's loads of amazing diagrams and stuff. I don't know if anyone wants to hear me go on about this, because I will talk about this book a lot, and I should. It wasn't part of the plan, but it's new. Excited. I'll try and find some diagrams. So he goes back to Japan in late 1920 with his notebooks, his knowledge about how to make whiskey, but also a new Scottish wife. He didn't have an old wife before, just a new wife. He was Scottish. And he started, wanted to build distilleries in Japan. He started working for someone else initially because he didn't have enough money. So he had knowledge but no money. This other guy had money but no knowledge. So they teamed up and they built the first proper Japanese whiskey distillery. I can say other distilleries had been making whiskey before that. Okay. And that was 1923. So we're almost at 100 years. Okay. So, it was 100 years last year since Taketsuru, wrote this. Oh.
Yeah.
And also since they got married and stuff as well. So there's been all kinds of anniversaries, and we're still looking for more anniversaries coming up in the next few years. But so Taketsuru built designed and built and ran Japan's first whiskey distillery for a company that eventually became called Suntory, which I'm sure you've heard of. Worked for them for 10 years and then left and set up his own company, Nika, in 1934. Okay, so this is, he's responsible for any whiskies made, in Japan, any of them being made the proper way, basically. So he built himself 2 distilleries, and we're actually going to taste them kind of in the wrong order historically just now, because it's best for your palate. So the next whiskey we're going to taste is called Miyagi-Kyo. So please grab that. This is it. Oh yes, we're both. Miyagi-Kyo. I don't know why. waving thing. So he built this one in 1969. So this was his second distillery that he built for himself. So he built one for the other dude first, then he built himself one, and then he built this one. Okay. And it's in the Sendai province, so about 2-3 hours north of Tokyo by bullet train. So God knows how many hours by normal train. And inland, it's what looks like kind of highlands kind of situation. So lots of hills and valleys, a little bit of altitude, lots of rivers. And actually, he chose this site because he wandered around Japan for 2 years, tasting rivers to try and find one that reminded him of the ones he tried in Scotland. So Taketsuru really took to heart everything that he'd learned in Scotland. All the kind of things that the distillery guys in Scotland thought were important, the climate, the water, these little production kind of tweaks that, that he learned while he was there. No one else had that information in Japan. Everyone else was kind of working off his quite, simple notes and doing this kind of thing. So he very much believed that the closer conditions you could find to Scotland, be it climate, landscape, water, the better your whiskey would be. Okay. So let's give this a try. Now, another thing about Miyagikyo is about how to say it, because you look at that word up at the top of the slide and you're like, oh, here. But luckily there's a trick, because Kyo means valley in Japanese. And so this, if it was made in Scotland, would be Glen Miyagi. Miyagi is the name of this valley. Okay. And I'm sure everyone's seen Karate Kid. Hopefully they have. So if you're not sure how to say this whiskey, just remember Mr. Miyagi. And then Kyo. So Miyagi Kyo. Okay. Now, ideally, each syllable should be the same length, but us Europeans are bad enough. Do whatever you need to do to get it happen. But Miyagi is the way to start off. Okay. So you should be smelling this whiskey and realizing there's tons going on in this. Now, what Taketsuru did, compared to the other distilleries that we're trying today, his aim was to make blends. Okay. He wanted to blend. In the time when he learned about whiskey in Scotland, blended whiskey was cool and single malts were uncool. So he was very focused on making blends. Obviously, it's flipped over now. But he realized that, he couldn't do what was done in Scotland, which is all the different distilleries make their own specific type of whiskey. And then when they want to make a blend, they buy it from all the different distilleries and mush it together and you're blending it. He had 2 distilleries. The reason he built 2 was to try and make more flavors, so they had more variety for making blends, but also because he'd left that other guy's company, the Suntory company, he wasn't able to buy from him, and he wouldn't have sold him any whiskey either. They were not friends. Okay, they were rivals. And so what he started doing was making as many different flavors of whiskey as he could at his distilleries. So, for example, he would use different peat levels. So you make single malt whiskey in batch process. I'm sure everyone knows that. So Monday, you're going to do unpeated barley. We'll use yeast strain A. We'll ferment for 90 hours, and we use these settings on the still, and we'll put it in that cask type. Okay. But then on Tuesday, we're going to do completely different. We're going to use medium peated barley, yeast strain C. We'll ferment for 60 hours, and we use completely different settings on the same stills, and we'll put that all in sherry casks. Okay. So he made at his 2 distilleries, but each one of his distilleries, loads of different styles of whiskey. Okay, and it's a thing that wasn't really done in Scotland in those days. It is done in Scotland now. If you look at some of the younger distilleries particularly, they will make a variety of different peat levels, different styles of things to give themselves some more flavour variation. So this was all kind of started happening really in Japan. And so this is why this one now smells so rich and so complex and so much going on, because this could be all 600 of the types of whiskey that are produced at Miyagikyo Distillery. Okay, the 600 that Taketsuru ended up with, and it's not all 600. It's about 100 to 120, but that's still a lot more than the things that we have been tasting earlier. It's the same spirit, or what you'd potentially get at other distilleries. So there'll be some peaty barley in here, some unpeated barley in here, lots of different yeast strains and fermentation times, still settings, and cask types. Miyagikyo generally focuses on lower peat levels, but obviously compared to the 3 unpeated things we just tasted, it's going to taste a wee bit peaty. And Miyagikyo also generally focuses on sherry cask. So think of Oloroso and PX casks, but there will be Virgin American Oak, ex-bourbon, refill casks, recharred American they do here as well, and what they call remade, where you've got an older cask, you take the ends off, put new wood on the ends, but leave the staves as old. So it's a kind of combo barrel.
Yeah. All sorts going on, basically.
Yeah, and this is 45%, I should have said, sorry.
Yeah.
So here's a picture of Miyagikyo while we're tasting it. I think it tastes very much like it looks, actually, the distillery. It's very green, it's very foresty, it's very fresh. There are those kind of honey, fruity notes coming from those sherry casks. There is that little hint of kind of distant peat on the winds there. I kind of joke about this distillery as well. I think it looks quite Scottish. But also, when I arrived the first time, it was raining so hard, I couldn't see any of the buildings. I was like, yeah, this is exactly like Scotland. Takitsuru chose well.
Pretty much.
Yeah. So really, really beautiful place. And the middle of nowhere as well. Really windy roads through the hills. Takes quite a while to get there. Beautiful. Now, yeah, I love this one. I'm a PT girl as well, usually, so I should naturally prefer Miyagikyo's brother, which we'll taste in a second. But this one is just amazing. Always, it's got the right amount of peat in there. But it's the floral, herbaceous kind of flavors that really get me, I think. So what was I about to say? I can't remember. I was about to say something. We were like, it's delicious.
I've sidetracked us, so
yeah, it's okay, don't worry. So like I say, Miyagikyo built in 1969. So in those days it was all mod cons. It had kind of steam fired stills and all kinds of kind of modern technology. So this was a distillery that was built with a bit more money than Takitsuru's first one, which we'll get to next. That was built with baling twine and some random tubs that were lying around, essentially. But very, very beautiful here. So the other thing you might notice in this picture is loads of warehouses. And the thing that people know quite a lot about Japanese whiskey, particularly the single malts, is there's been a big shortage for the last 10 years. And people see that and they're like, hey, they're kind of, pranking us. There is no shortage. Look at all those warehouses. But what you might also realize about Japan is it has a bit of a tendency for earthquakes, and that is that problem all over the country. And they don't want to end up with a whiskey waterfall. So what they do in their warehouses, they just have one row. It's dunnage warehouses here, so all the earthen floors. They have the casks lying on their side, and then they have one cask on top of it, and that is it. That is as high as they'll let it go, because if they go any higher, the casks might all fall down and smash open. So while it looks like a lot of warehouses, all of them are very short and only have 2 rows of barrels in them. So 2 rows of casks in them. So a very small quantity of whiskey.
When you think about it, isn't actually that big. I mean, I know you can obviously get different size barrels, but I'm guessing, are they probably using about 600 litre barrels, or maybe something? I guess they're using a mixture, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Sherry casks are bigger. The ones are smaller.
But they're not. Barrels aren't as big as I think people think. You can get big sort of couple 1,000 litre ones, but generally speaking, they're not as big as people sort of tend to think they are.
Even 2 sherry casks on top of each other is about my height. Maybe a bit taller, a bit fatter, but so not very tall at all. So these buildings are all kind of, you duck in to go in, and then you should only really stand at the kind of pointy bit. So just in case the picture's making you think there's lots of warehouses full of whiskey there. There's not, and that was the other thing I was going to talk about, was the age of this. So having talked about Takitsuru focusing on finding areas as similar to Scotland as possible, the climate, he focused on finding an area where the climate was as similar to Scotland as well. So not just the water tasting like Scotland, but the temperature here at Miyagikyo is about 1.5 degrees warmer on average across the year than Inverness. Okay, so it's a bit colder in the winter and a bit warmer in the summer, but it averages out basically the same. So the whiskies don't age fast. So we had our 2 companies with the tropical aging at the beginning, but this Miyagikyo is around 10 years old, some we're a bit younger, some a bit older in here, so probably 8 to kind of 15-ish. But it's not had any tropical aging, so it's just aging at the same rate as you'd find in Scotland. Angel share is pretty much the same as Scotland as well. Okay, so this is one of the ones that's not tropically aged tonight. Yeah, I love it.
If you smell the Cavalan bourbon one in comparison, it smells so like golden syrup and like And you go back to the Miyagikyo, and it's the peat comes out a bit more. Then I think when you first have it, when you move on, we had a little bit of a break. The peat isn't something I think you necessarily notice straight away, but if you go back to the bourbon, and then go back to the Miyagikyo, it does start to come out, and you get. I think
it makes the peat pop a little bit.
Yeah, the sort of floral notes kind of come through a bit more on that.
Yeah, so I think it's really funny because most people always think of Miyagikyo as the lower peat one out of the Nikas, and it is, but because you always taste it in the order that you're coming from unpeated, you go into Miyagikyo and then you get heavier. It does. People quite often are like, "Oh, it's really peaty," and you're like, "Oh, hold on a second, no, like, it's not really," but it just feels like comparatively. So the thing that I got when I went back to the Cavalan bourbon was Jamaican ginger cake, kind of smell like delicious, delicious.
I mean, like that sort of like syrupy sponge, but like ginger. Yeah.
So that's kind of the flavor. But yeah, so keep going backwards and forwards as you go. Give a little smell on the amrit. Yeah, it smells even more barley-ish now as well.
I was gonna say the amrit just smells like field of barley.
Delicious, yeah. Fresh, you can almost see like the gold kind of waves going ahead of you. So now we'll compare this one again. Don't finish this one if you haven't already. To its brother. So, like I've been saying, Taketsuru built himself 2 distilleries. The one that we just tasted was his second. And we'll go to Yoichi now, which looks quite similar, but 2 symbols. It's a shorter word, Yoichi, rather than Miyagikyo, which is 3 symbols. And try that. So this was Taketsuru's original distillery that he built for himself. Now, he did build the one for the other guy, the Suntory guy first. He built Yamazaki, designed it, built it, ran it for its first few years, and then left that complete and built himself Yoichi. So this is more traditional distillery, more old school. I have a map. Good. I was like, I have a map. Why would I not have a map? So it's, as you can see, we talked about Miyagikyo. It was further, kind of, 2/3 up the country on the right-hand side. This is the very top of the country, the island of Hokkaido, on the left-hand side. And it's actually where a river estuary meets the sea. So Taketsuru, when he was in Scotland, he worked at Hazelburn Distillery in Campbelltown. And that's actually what that book that I keep going on about is mostly focusing on the distillery that he's getting his knowledge from. And so this is kind of the type of thing that he was trying to replicate when he built Yoichi, was the kind of Campbelltown style. So coastal and island, not an island, but end of a peninsula type of thing. So it's got all that kind of stuff happening. So it's named, rather than the valley, this is where a river meets the sea. So it's named after the Yoichi River. Okay. And he built it in 1934, slowly. It took him a while to build it. He had no money. So what they initially did, him and his Scottish wife, Rita, she was with him through all of this, was initially made juices, apple juice, pear juice, plum juice, because they grow a lot of orchards, have a lot of orchards up in that area, made fruit juices, and then started making ciders once they got their fermentation tanks. The company still makes apple brandy and cider. If you can visit Yoichi, you can buy cider from there. There's a red can and a blue can, and one is sweet and one is dry. And I can't remember. I always buy them both because for me the mix is perfect. But you're in a bus on the way back from Yoichi and you've had loads of whiskey and you just walk.
And you just you need something.
Exactly. This is where the name Nika comes from as well. So the original company was called Dai Nippon Kaju Kabushiki, which roughly translates to the Great Japanese Juice Company. And so then when the whiskey sales, once they started selling their whiskey, they actually made a very accidentally successful juice company. So the juice company kind of carried on selling, and it sort of funded them through every other bit of making this whiskey. Rita was helpful as well. She was teaching English and teaching piano to the children of wealthy families in the area. So, they're just doing everything they can to bring money in so they can make this whiskey. But when whiskey started overtaking juice sales, it wasn't until the 1950s. That's when they took the ni and the ka from Nippon and Kaji Kabushiki and smooshed it all together and made Nika. So it doesn't mean anything in Japanese. It's just the name of, I used to say a Brangelina, but I can't now. So Benifer, I believe Benifer are back. I don't know if anyone's up on this gossip.
Oh, isn't J-Lo with someone like Ben Affleck?
Benifer, yeah, Benifer.
Yes, yeah. Sorry, I was thinking of Jennifer Aniston.
Oh right, no, who's she? Oh my goodness. Well, no, we can't get into that. Anyway, it's called a portmanteau, and I should just call it that, but I prefer calling it
yeah.
So Taketsuru focused on this area, like I say, for access to peat, the water source, and barley, and similarity to Scotland. So Miyagiki is 1.5 degrees warmer on average in Inverness across the year. Yoichi is only half a degree different. So even closer, it's further north. So even closer to the kind of right temperature. Again, a bit warm in the summer, a bit colder in the winter. As you can see from this picture, lovely lush snow.
Yeah.
So again, this is 45%. Again, 10 years average, but we're going to sort of say 8 to 15 in the wider ranges of age. And Yoichi is known for heavier peat than Miyagiki. You can probably smell it now. And lower sherry cask usage. So more American oak, more virgin oak, refill, reused, recharred casks. More of those being used than the sherry. But there is still some sherry in it. Okay. So... And Taketsuru, you got to remember, built them to be opposite from each other. He built them to be as different from each other as possible, so that when he made loads of different flavors at each distillery, they weren't overlapping. Because if you're making tons of effort to make this particular flavor at this distillery, you don't want to go to tons of effort to make the same bloody flavor at a different distillery. That's no use to you. So he built them and designed them to be as different from each other as possible. Okay, so everything about their situation.
This one feels a lot drier than the Miyagikyo as well.
Much more savory. Yeah, less of that fruitiness coming through. Obviously, the peat's heavier. It's not crazy heavy peat. I think if anyone is sensitive to smoky whiskies, you might still find this one kind of quite approachable. It's definitely got a solid smoky flavour, but on the nose, it doesn't kind of jump up at you. It doesn't try and make your eyes bleed. It's very, very polite and gentle, and it just gives you a lovely kind of smoky hit on the kind of sides. The other thing about this one is all the spirit is aged there. All Yoichi is aged at Yoichi. All Miyagikyo is aged at Miyagikyo. This is next to the sea. And so therefore you've got that slight salty hint coming through at the end of the palate, which I think really helps sort of tie all those flavors together. But super earthy, smoky, oily texture, and not the same oily texture that we have in the Amrit from the barley. This is a different one. So look out for that. Now the reason for the oily texture is actually about the stills. We'll get to the still shape in just a second. But the other main thing that Yoichi has that's unusual, and this is because it was built in 1934, is they have coal-fired stills. So they're people shoveling coal underneath these stills all day, every day, and that's what heats the stills up. Now, when Taketsuru learned about how to make whiskey in Scotland, this is how almost everyone, heated their stills. And some people were transferring over to gas, and then a lot of people transferred over to steam heating. And now there are no distilleries in Scotland still using coal furnaces to heat their stills. So the traditional ones in Scotland are seen as gas, and that's even more modern than this, basically. So this, I kind of joke, one of the most traditional distilleries in the world, and it's not in Scotland. So it's the Japanese love and adore tradition. So changing this now would be like implying that Taketsuru didn't build it in the best possible way. This is unthinkable. Okay, so they're going to keep the traditional thing going. So this means that the spirit running through the still goes super, super fast. It's very, very hot in there. Too hot, really. The wash burns onto the bottom of the wash still, which gives you different flavors. There's a reaction called the Maillard reaction, which if you sear a steak on a barbecue or you cook toast and you get that nice browning of the toast, the things that make cooking food delicious, that happens in the bottom of the still. Okay, and it doesn't happen when you've got slow steam heated still. It only happens when you've got super hot direct fire. So the bottom of these stills is between 700 and 1,000 degrees C, which is far too hot. So they're a bugger to operate. It's very, very difficult to do, but it gives you flavors that you can't get anywhere else. And if you try vintage whiskies from the 60s and stuff like that, quite often one of the reasons they taste different. And why they're so revered, partly because people did much longer fermentations in those days, but potentially partly because of this sort of still setup and using the coal fire. Okay, so I'm not sure if anyone can taste. It's not like coal smoke, but there is a definite kind of, difference to it. It's like that oily texture as well.
Yeah. So that's slightly kind of that smell you get from a barbecue, from a coal barbecue,
Yeah. I kind of joke, it reminds me of a student, when I was a student, burnt pan bottom. If your first time you're trying to cook baked beans and you're like, no, I'll just turn around for a second. I'm sure it was stone cold a minute ago. And then suddenly you're like, everything's burnt on the bottom. And it happened in no time at all. Not in a nasty way. There's still a nice carbonization kind of flavor to it, if you once you pick out the big burnt bits. But it depends how hungry you were as a student, I think, and how useless. I was quite useless.
Mm.
So, yeah.
So for me, it's still got a little bit of sweetness in it, but you get that at the front on the beginning of your palate, and it finishes really nice and dry, quite salty.
Yeah.
Quite kind of briny, almost, like that kind of, when you have like olives and they're in obviously like a brine, and you get that sort of flavor. And
definitely. Yeah, completely right. And the sweetness, at the front is, there's American oak cask in there, vanilla, butterscotch toffee. There's a few sherry casks in there, a little bit of fruitiness. But everything else in here is kind of oily and savory, and
yeah, it goes through everything, doesn't it? That's what.
Yeah, it's a delicious one. So Yoichi was actually the first single malt from Japan to win best single malt in the world. So this was in 2001. So up until then, the Japanese have been making whiskey for quite a long time, but most of it was kind of a lot of cheap blends for the local market. They would do, little bits here and there, think about exporting, but not really seriously. And had started making sort of single malts, even though that's not really what they want. They really want to drink blends. Still now, they've never, kind of moved through from blends like we have into single malts and, potentially out the other end. Still, blends are the absolute focus. So, start producing a few single malts, seeing about, the response in other countries, that kind of thing. But in 2001, everything changed. Yoichi, best single malt in the world, this massive kind of whiskey tasting panel. Suddenly the whiskey industry sits up and it's like, what? Interesting. Okay. And then award after award after award after award start piling in. And obviously then consumers realize it's in all the papers, and it took a few years. But about 10 years ago is when things really sort of kicked off for the wider public. But 10 years before that was when the whiskey industry were like, I think this might be good. I might actually start getting some of this. So here's some differences in the stills, just in case you are wanting to geek out on the still shape for Yoichi and Miyagikyo. So the different temperatures here, and the kind of the different shapes of them, just giving different flavors as well. Okay, for the Yoichi. So Yoichi much more traditional, much more old school. Miyagikyo much more modern on the right there. Okay. So yeah, nice though. Nice differences.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's interesting is, this is just a few of the single malts from Yoichi. Remember, there's 600 available. This is just 100-ish of them. So, I just said, Miyagikyo, traditionally more peaty, less sherry cask. You could, if you go around the casks at the distillery, you could find an unpeated sherry cask Miyagikyo. It's there. They make it. The same with Miyagikyo. Miyagikyo usually low peat and sherry cask. You could find a heavily peated ex-bourbon cask
Yeah.
at Miki, so these are all your options. You've got tons going on, and that helps make the Nika blends, which I'm sure people have tried, hopefully Nika from the barrel and Nika Days and a few of the other blends that Nika makes. That's what gives them so much flavor, so many layers, to be able to add all these things together.
I think that's one thing that, that's quite interesting, that from a kind of sales point of view, when you, when you get people that come in and they're looking for a whiskey, generally speaking, they'll go, oh, if say they're looking for a present, they'll be like, oh, I want a whiskey. It needs to be a single malt, and then kind of Scottish. You think, okay, great. So you go through the options, etc. But you sometimes can get people that go, oh, looking for a whiskey, not necessarily set on something Scottish. So then when you start talking about, Japanese whiskey, and you can go through the options with them. And one of the things that you find is that most, as you said, most Japanese whiskies are blended, and they're blends. And I think people are a lot more accepting of blended whiskey in the Japanese sort of realm of things than they are in the Scottish realm of things. But blend. One thing that we do have to sometimes communicate to customers is that if it says blended on Japanese whiskey, it's because blending is a real art over there. Blending is done so meticulously. It's not a case of like, well, we've got this single, got this malt here, but we'll put some grain or we'll put some of this in it just to, keep the cost down, or the ABV or whatever. We don't have to pay as much duty or whatever, Not that I'm saying that that's what happens in Scotland. There are some very good blenders in Scotland as well. And in actual fact, majority of whiskies that you buy, unless you buy a single cask, they're all blended to some extent because the blends of different casks in there, aren't they? So even
it's such a shame the word blend is, I think particularly amongst the older drinker, become a bit of a dirty word, and it shouldn't be, because it is an art form, and it is done in the vast majority of whiskies that people drink. And even people think, they're massive single malt snobs. All of those pretty much will be blended as well. They'll just be blends of the casks available at that distillery. So so it's an interesting thing. It's such a shame that I think people react the way they do to the word blended.
People are more accepting of Japanese blending than they are of Scottish blending.
Definitely. I think that's the thing. If you're already open-minded enough to maybe drink a Japanese whiskey over here, then you're like, okay, cool. And I think because it is what the Japanese focus on so much. Also, I think quite often the Japanese proportion of malt in their blends is maybe a bit, Nika do one called Nika Tailored, and it's 60% malt, and 40% grain, which is just not a thing that you get here. So malt drinkers are like, okay, yeah, fine, rather than just the tiny drizzles you sometimes get. So, there's a lot of differences, I think. But I think, again, maybe the Japanese culture and the way that it's talked about, the art of blending, that kind of balance and harmony, all that kind of stuff, is more maybe accepted. And I think also blends over here quite often are seen as cheap. Like my granny drank kind of grouse 5 o'clock every day, and she got it from the supermarket, £10 a bottle, probably even cheaper. Whereas even Japanese blends are quite expensive because they've had to travel. So there's that bit more extra kind of, I don't know, respect given in.
And then there's always the thing of shortage of Japanese whiskey as well, and
doesn't hurt, does it? I'm just joking. So Nika went on to 2-shift production. So they went into full production about 8-9 years ago. So that's why there's been a bit of a shortage, because it was not old enough to release, but the sales were kind of going up. So we're about to be hopefully in a position in a few years, and we have been in the last few years. But also Nika last year went on to 2-shift production. So trying to double their production. Now, they don't produce it in the coldest months of the year or different times, but when they are producing, they're producing twice as much. So I kind of joke that probably the same time that we start actually having enough of it will be the same time that people are like, oh, it's not cool anymore. It's part of it. It's super cool. It is, because it's cool. Like hard to find. I know, it's going to be so typical. But
just something else rare, and they'll go something really obscure and rare that you can't get, then suddenly that'll become popular.
I mean, it's not like Japanese whiskey is going to change its quality, I think, or they're producing more. They're not doing it differently, and they're not, they didn't double the sizes of distills. They're just running them twice as often. So it's so I think it should still taste as good. And you respect the flavor now and understand where they come from now, and hopefully we'll still do that in the future.
I think it will. I think, you know, we get some people that come in and they're interested in collecting Japanese whiskey and things like that, but we have sort of said to a few people, well, it is in the nicest way possible, you are a bit late. It's become such a commodity, and one of those things, not commodity, sorry, it's become such a rarity. You know, the kind of older stocks of things, and you know, people are really into it. But you know, I think people will always be interested in it.
Yeah, and I still meet people in the street who are like, I didn't know Japan made whiskey, and I'm like, it's almost 100 years, dude. So you know, I suppose there's still those people, I guess, we're going to speak to. It's okay. Okay, so last whiskey, we're going to go back to India. Having just talked about coal fire, here's a lovely shot of a cask being recharred. And that was just to remind me, really, the picture of what we're about to taste. Again, you've got the newer, sexier bottle. I've got the slightly older vintage model, 70s model. And this is Amrit Fusion. This is Amrit's flagship whiskey. And we are upping the ABV. We're upping the peat level. So everyone get their palates ready. And we are doing something interesting. So I was talking about Amrit when they started, and obviously they were using, for the first whiskey that we tried, 100% Indian barley. Remember the 6-row barley, which gives you tons more flavour and that amazing texture. Now, the thing that they really struggled with, because they, again, unlike in Taiwan, because they were drinking Scottish whiskey a lot earlier, quite a lot more whiskey traditionally in Scotland was peated. This is quite a lot of the early whiskies in India that they got to like, that we made them like, was peaty. And so they were like, okay, how can we peat this Indian barley? And Amrit don't have a malting house. They could have built one, but it's a lot of faff, and it's a lot, and as a lot of distilleries in Scotland know, it's very expensive, not a great plan business-wise. So they're like, we could do, but we don't really want to. So they were getting their barley malted in this malt house in Delhi. There's a commercial malting for other people. So they were like, hi, would you like burning some dirt while you're malting? And they're like, no, thanks. We don't really fancy that. No, thanks. Actually, the other thing about peating things in India is they do have peat. You find peat in 90% of the world's countries. All you need is kind of a boggy area. But it's made from different plants, and so this, when you burn it, you actually get quite an acrid, different smell. Whereas the plants that you get in different regions of Scotland, they're different plants from each other, but they all burn quite nicely. So you know, they could have shipped some peat over from Scotland, and then people did the small things that didn't want to do it. Or they could have shipped the Indian barley over to Scotland, had it malted there with peat, and all of this just seems silly. So they did the next easiest thing, and the second whiskey that Amrit released, not this one, was Amrit peated, and they shipped over peaty malted barley and made whiskey from that. And you're like, oh, of course, because nothing says in any of the whiskey rules that your barley has to come from the same place that you're making the whiskey. Half the Scotches don't use Scottish barley, there isn't enough. Okay. We talked earlier, Taiwan was using European barley. Quite a lot of that will come from the Scottish malt houses. You get it from all over Europe. And Japan does the same as well for their peated stuff. It gets from the Scottish malt houses. So this is what Amrit did with their second whiskey. They had their unpeated Indian barley, then they had their peated European barley. And they made them basically the same way. And the lovely thing about comparing Amrit's standard single malt, which we tried, and the peated, is just to sort of see the difference in texture, the difference in peatiness, but know that pretty much everything else is about the same in those. But then they were like, oh, but we're kind of losing in the Amrit peated. We've lost the texture of that Indian barley. It's what made it Indian. It was delicious, and it was kind of unusual, and it was amazing. And we'd really like to kind of see if we can work these two things together. So this is where Amrit Fusion comes in. It is a fusion of the peated European barley coming from Scottish malt houses and unpeated Indian barley, the 6-row barley, together. Okay, so they make the whiskey from that, and it's super delicious and unusual, and I love that Amrit unpeated. But for me, as a peaty kind of girl, the only way that could get better with that texture and that flavour is to add in some peat. And here, voila, we have it. Now, it is 50% ABV, and it is a wee bit older than the previous Amrit. Remember, we've got tropical aging happening here. So that last one was about 4.5 years old. This is about 5.5 years old. So it sounds like we've added 1 year on there, but it's 4 years in real terms. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's like going from a sort of tasting a sort of 12-year-old to a kind of 16-year-old. Okay, so that's the difference here. So lots of flavor on the nose, always with Amrit, and it's again looking for that balance between the barley flavor and the peat, obviously, and also the casks coming in. And again, this is ex-bourbon, but a little bit of virgin American oak. Might be a touch of sherry in here as well sometimes, but mostly ex-bourbon.
It's like a spicy, like,
yeah.
It reminds me a little bit of like a chili almost.
Yeah.
Like chili you get.
Well, I usually say with Amrit, and I don't know whether it's the power of suggestion as well. I'm thinking of India and what I have had of its food and what I think about when I think of India, but spices, loads of different, cardamom, all that kind of stuff. It's just incredible. So I just got some shots here. So that cask is being recharred. And actually, you see this liquid here really, really dark. No colouring added to this. It's not chill filtered. It's all completely natural. But some of that will be coming from an recharred cask. So that will give you a lot more colour coming through. So yeah, that extra year making such a difference here, eh? But it's also, like I say, slightly different mix of casks. And here's some lovely shiny new casks in the warehouse. So these guys have quite a few different small warehouses dotted all over the property. They didn't really build a massive kind of commercial one. They are trying to build some more. But currently they've got a few different things. But again, it's absolutely roasting. The warehouses are a few degrees cooler than the outside temperature in Bangalore. But these guys are also getting 12 to 16% a year angel share. So what I told you about Kavalan earlier, they're getting the same angel share. Kavalan are trying to do something about it. Amrit, not really. They just joke that India's got a lot more gods, and so therefore a lot more angels. And they're like, we'll just have to deal with it. So, it must be devastating that you've made this whiskey and then, you age it for 5 years, you lose, let's say, 16% a year. Like, what? That is a lot. So I'm sure you can imagine.
You've got what, you've got a 225 litre cask. 10% a year is 25 litres of that cask. If you're aging that for 4 or 5 years, you really use it, easily over 100 litres, and that's in a smaller cask.
Yeah, it's a nightmare, complete nightmare. So the Amrit they were, as I sort of mentioned before, they were India's first single malt. So there are a couple of other companies now making single malt, and we do get them in the UK as well. So look out for those. They're quite interesting to compare. And they all have sort of similar problems with the speed of aging and the angel share. Amrit's released the oldest ever Indian malts. So they've done a 10-year-old and then they did a 12-year-old, and both those were called Greedy Angels because that is what they are basically saying as they open this cafe, is yelling into it, greedy angels, just scraping out the tiny little molecule of liquid left. So they're amazing. We get, if they do a Greedy Angel release, we get 6 bottles for the UK. They are sold before they get here. They are quite expensive, and I don't even get to try them. So I've tried one once, and it was amazing, and like velvet. But unsurprisingly, the reputation of their whiskey is just top notch. If Amrit do a single, a limited release, it's just usually gone in a flash.
Yeah.
So, yeah, they're good guys.
The question is, where do they end up though? Do they end up in collections, or do they end up being opened or on auctions?
I think there's a bit of both. I've met a guy actually in the Midlands who has every Amrit ever.
Really?
Yeah, wow. Loves it. I think he buys a couple though. Usually, I think he still definitely drinks it. But he also, I think, keeps
to be fair, we've got a customer that's that's into his whiskies, and he's into his Campbelltown whiskies, and I honestly think he must have one of the best collections out there.
You sure he's not drinking it?
Well, he does drink them, but I think he's had, from what he told me, I think he's had crazy rare bottles. I'm like, how have you managed to get on? I don't know how. Sometimes you just meet those people that are just really good at doing those things.
Yeah. And you're like, we're in the industry, we should be able to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this is the thing about Amrit, like, and I forgot to tell people the name earlier because I just did the name of Nika and I did the name of Kavalan earlier. So Amrit, there was an old story in kind of like Hindi legend, basically, kind of almost like Greek mythology, but the Hindi version. All the gods having a big fight, and one of the gods, the sea god, kind of got injured and sloped off to sort of heal his wounds on this island, and drank this stuff from this plant, kind of like nectar, that healed him, and it was called Amrit. That's what this is. So kind of healing, which we can't officially say, obviously, healing nectar of the gods, is kind of the deal here. So that's what it's named after. I think what I love about Amrit is, a lot of people, people in Britain, it's still quite traditional, focusing on Scottish whiskey. They might not have heard much about Indian whiskey. They might have really low expectations. The labels look really old school. So I think, for me, if you meet someone and they've got Amrit in their cupboard, they know. You don't buy that by accident. You don't get it. So for me, Amrit is almost a sign of people who've really explored the world of whiskey. If you know your Amrit, then you're like, okay, I've traveled this. I've been out for quite a while. We've been, in the UK, all the whiskey shows. If you've experienced an Amrit and you've got one in your cupboard, it's because you have tried it. The liquid is incredible.
Yeah, definitely. And it's because as I was talking about Japanese whiskey earlier from a consumer and like a sort of sales point of view, Japanese whiskey, there is an interest in it. People that generally, if they're interested in whiskey, they will have heard about Japanese whiskey, and they'll be intrigued by it, or they might drink it quite often. They might have had a little bit before and want to learn more. And we've got whiskies from other countries. So Sweden, we've got, it's quite a popular place, and people are quite interested in the idea of Swedish whiskey. But as you kind of travel into the other sort of Asian countries and, other sort of nations now producing whiskey, you kind of think, people kind of stand there and they go, Indian? You can be making whiskey in India? And they really don't believe, like, it's a much harder sort of sale.
Yeah. People's expectations are low. And I think I should have started with this probably, actually. I think a lot of people, I remember meeting a lot of people at whiskey shows, and they'll say, oh, made in India, so what's it made of? Is it even whiskey? Well, and all that kind of stuff. And you're like, well, okay, firstly, bit harsh. But actually, the kind of really interesting, I think the useful thing for us to realize is, if you're buying something in the UK, it has to follow our laws for production. So like I said earlier, India is making huge quantities of whiskey, but they can't send it here if they haven't made it according to what we would define a whiskey. They wouldn't be allowed to write that on the label. They wouldn't be allowed to ship it to us, okay? And single malt has even more rules. All of these tonight have been single malts. And they can't use the word Scotch. Fair enough. Okay, no one wants to. It's okay. But that phrase single malt, to be on a bottle, you have to be making it properly. I think a lot of people maybe let their kind of inner racism kind of come out a little bit when they're meeting whiskey from other countries. And if you're in another country, then I'm not saying be racist, but potentially be more wary, be more careful. Because if you're in another country, its rules for what a whiskey needs to be or what a single malt needs to be might be very different or none at all. Most of these countries tonight, very, very gentle rules on what whiskey needs to be. But if you're buying it and drinking it in the UK, it's come through the UK sort of customs tax system, then it has to be made properly. And so this is something to be kind of confident with, and not let those kind of things come to mind. So I think that's the thing about Amrit.
One thing I've kind of noticed as well with a lot of the whiskey, with all the whiskey that we've had tonight, the brands as well, they're all labelled as whiskey but spelt without an E, so spelt WHISKY, which is the Scots version of of spelling whiskey. And obviously the American version is with the E in there, and the Irish adopted that. So there's a point of kind of difference. And these are all countries that have produced whiskey after Scotland did. They've taken, as with
I usually sort of talk about the rule a little bit. So basically, if you imagine the two origin countries are Scotland and Ireland. Okay, so Scotland's without the E, Ireland generally, most often with the E. And other countries that learned to make whiskey learned from them. So America was mostly Irish immigrants. So it learned about it again always. Canada learned more from Scotland. Just Japan, Taiwan, India all learned from Scotland, as we've kind of discussed already. So if you look at the two origin countries and everything spreading out from there, it makes it much easier to get, I think.
Yeah, and you can see that they're kind of looking to what is the Scottish standard of whiskey here.
But I like the way they let their own countries influence things as well. Like there could be a lot of people just trying to make Scotch faster and cheaper and kind of but it turns out not that much cheaper once you factor in that angel share, once you factor in the shipping. I mean, Scotland getting those casks over from America, there's so many coming over, and from sherry kind of country, it's quite easy to get hold of casks. Over in other countries that maybe don't have a whiskey industry, that's much harder, so therefore expensive, and the shipping is harder. So it's it all balances out in the end, and you end up with delicious whiskies in different styles, with different flavors from different reasons, that might give you might have your standard whiskey that you drink at this drinking occasion, but you might be like, oh, you know what, when I feel a little bit more like that, or it's a little bit more summery, I'll want one of those Taiwanese ones, the tropical ones, and totally different flavors happening. So I think it's the whole world to explore and embrace.
Yeah, definitely. So what would be your favorite of the night then?
I was about to ask you the same.
To ask that question.
No, I was about to ask you the same. I struggle tonight, actually. So I usually go with this final one. And you know what? It tasted a bit different tonight after Yuichi. I usually don't taste it straight after Yuichi. And that's the kind of thing that's quite interesting. So hopefully everyone's going backwards and forwards and seeing how they all kind of compare to each other. For me, the Miyagikyo really stood out tonight. I think just because it's such a massive difference in flavour. We'd come from super, unpeated bourbon cask into lots of sherry and a little bit of peat. So
I think the Miyagikyo might have been my favourite of the night.
Yeah.
Lineup. But I did also really like the Cavalan Bourbon. Wow. I really liked how dry it was on the finish.
Yeah, it's really good, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think tasting the thing that the cask says it is because usually when you say a cask, it's either a finish or it's got those second fill, third fills in there. But that just really had such a bourbony note to it.
Yeah, I think the thing that was quite interesting about that as well is usually when you think of bourbon, you think of, like, as you say, like vanilla, butterscotch, coconut, all those like really quite sweet kind of flavors. And there was those present in it, but then, as I said, it finished really dry and didn't finish too sweet or sickly or anything. It was a nice kind of balance on that.
And the first Cavalan though showed all the fruity sort of sweeter notes of the Cavalan. So hopefully that's the other thing that we've tried to do tonight is pick a range from the country, not just to say that each country only produces this one flavour of whiskey. Each country has quite a range to it, and it's definitely worth exploring. So hopefully that helped a little bit tonight and showcase that. So lots of options. I can't pick a favourite.
No, it's too hard.
Do you have a favourite country out of them then? Like, we've got 3 countries there. I know. That's mean, isn't it?
That's a good question. I think probably, I'm going to be a bit boring, probably Japan.
Yeah, I think most people choose Japan. I like India, I think, personally.
Yeah. The Indian ones are really interesting, like really, they're a much different sort of style, so I think they're really interesting. I think the Japanese, they're just, I think because so much goes into them, because they're from hundreds of different casks, you just get this lovely layered, complex sort of style of whiskey, and that's something I really like generally when it comes to booze.
There might be anything on your palate as well that's responding to not tropical aging. Do you think there's maybe something in your palate that's responding to the slower aging?
Yeah, because I think what I've sort of found, as I'm in my late 20s now, as I'm getting older, that I've gone off a lot of the sort of sweeter sort of flavors and things like that. So I mean, I was never, when I was younger, I always used to like chocolate, but I was never really into sort of sweets and sugary things. Well, to some extent, I could eat loads of chocolate, but if you had like if it was a choice between like dairy milk and Haribo, I would have gone for sort of dairy milk. But as I've got older, if you gave me the choice of between like having a starter or a dessert on, when you go out for a meal, I'd have a starter because I like that kind of the savory sort of saltiness, and I like that lingering kind of flavor you get in it. So I think that's probably why those. The Japanese, where they've got that sort of softer aging process, cooler aging as well, and you don't tend to get that as much of that full-on sweetness. But maybe.
This is what I'm thinking about. And I think, like, for people, for anyone who's listening, if you've had your favorites and maybe you have a favorite country or you have a favorite whiskey, it's quite nice to sort of try and explore why you think that could be, what it is you liked about it, and what you'd look for then in future choices that might give you the same kind of thing. So I think, some people are just like, I like that, I don't like that, tick across type of thing. What is it? And then none of these are duds. They've all got amazing kind of points to them. I think all of them have complexity and smoothness and balance and interest. They've got very different flavors. And again, there might be, I usually drink this type of thing, but on this, this type of day, it's warmer, it's colder, it's hotter. I feel a little bit different. Then try different things. So it's there's lots of options. I think it's just quite nice to sometimes think about like, where the flavor came from and why that might be appealing to you.
I do think the Amaret fusion is really interesting though.
Yeah, it's a beast. I love it. I love stronger, like it's not cask strength, but it's stronger. So that's my kind of jam. It's got peatiness. The Indian barley, I love that kind of idea that, we've been focusing on yields. I kind of, I love small production things. I love traditional production things. I love the idea that, we are starting to get away from just focusing on, how cheaply can we make it. The
thing I like about the Amaret fusion is that you get the peat on it, but it's because you've got that really kind of creamy, quite rich barley in there as well, the Indian barley. It tones the peat down from being that really medicinal kind of character, because I think that's what I find sometimes can be a bit overwhelming and a bit too much. And I like that sort of slightly creamier, slightly sweeter sort of style of peat. I know going against what I just said, but
totally. I think it's a texture, but it's creamy and it is sweet, but it's also more savory. You've got more of those kind of bready notes in there. So there's all that happening too.
Sort of, that's what it is. I was going to say there was something on my mid palate, and I was like, what is it? And it's like that kind of bready dough note. That's what it is.
It's delicious.
But they're all really good whiskeys. So
exactly. So hopefully that's been a nice little introduction to some Asian whiskey producing countries and distilleries and then styles that you can get. But there's tons more to explore, guys. So definitely keep trying. There's we're doing lots more tastings. There's lots of whiskey shows happening now. So I think
starting the whiskey show. Is it starting tomorrow or Saturday?
Tomorrow, the one in London. Yeah, so tomorrow. In a few weeks, it'll be in Manchester. A few weeks in New York. Yeah, so
might have to come along to that.
Around, exactly. Up and around your zone.
So and it's great that we've got them here and we've gone through them and tasted them. But I know one thing that I think customers are kind of missing from our point of view is being able to come in store and sort of sample them. Because it really does make a difference when you can sort of sit here and try them, and you can show people the difference between the Miyagikyo and the Yoichi, and you give them a sample and they can taste it and go, this is okay, this is like this, and this is okay, I see why they're different, or why one is more suited to me, etc. But we are going to start bringing sampling back, which will be really good. It's been a long time. Once the shop refit's done and we've sorted out that and we've sorted out the samples that are all sat in the warehouse, we will have have some back, which is always good. So yeah,
that would be great. Yeah, really good idea. I think it does make such a difference to, like, you know, coming in to buy something, trying a few things.
So, but yeah, well, I hope everyone's enjoyed that. I think everyone's been quite quiet in terms of questions tonight, but
Very polite, haven't they?
Yeah. If anyone does have any questions, you know, do drop them to us, and we can put them forward to Steph, and always happy to answer any questions. So yeah. Anyway, I hope everyone has a lovely night, and thank you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed them. And if you do have a favourite, let us know which one you like. Just a quick word, actually, if anyone has found a favourite and they really like it, and they go onto the website and they can't find stock of it, it's because we've been stock counting. It'll be back up. All the stock will be back up on the website by the weekend. And I think we have got all of them in stock currently. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure we do.
Yeah.
But yeah, it might not show on the website if you're on there tonight, as in Thursday night. They will by the weekend. Anyway.
Okay.
So yeah.
Good to know.
But, yeah. Nice chat. It's been nice
Thanks
to chat.
very much for having me.
Yeah, no problem. And we'll see you all soon. So yeah. Thank you guys.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Bye.